You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're joined today by author Ron Peterson, who is here to talk to us about his fantastic book, Chasing the Squirrel. Ron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kristin, and thanks, Bill. It's great to be with you both.
It's funny, this feels like old home week now.
It sure does. You guys have been very kind over the years to have me on your show now several times.
And we definitely want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time right at the end of this, having you catch us up on all the developments in the Gina Renee Hall case and the documentary and all of the great work that you're doing on your end as well.
Thank you. I'll be happy to do that.
So let's go ahead and dive into this by talking about the case at the heart of your book, Chasing the Squirrel, and that is the case of Wally Thrasher. It's going to be a little hard to summarize, but give it a go. Can you summarize Wally Thrasher and his exploits for our listeners?
I sure will. Wally Thrasher, his full name was Wallace Samuel Thrasher. He was a notorious drug smuggler, more specifically a drug smuggling pilot who lived in Southwest Virginia. If he's alive today, he would be 83 years old. And we'll talk more about that. Big if is the caveat there. We'll dig into that a little bit. Wally's story, he was born in 1940. He grew up in Southwest Virginia in Pulaski. He's a good old boy growing up. Pulaski is a place near and dear to me. My first book, Under the Trestle, was about a murder case that took place there. We'll touch on that in a minute. Wally was the guy, I graduated from high school in 1958. He was somebody, and probably all of us knew someone like him in high school. He was this good-looking, charismatic guy that everything just came easy for him. Really athletic, really popular with the girls and guys, the kind of guy all the women wanted to be with him and all the guys wanted to be like him, right? And he was also, I guess, what we'd call nowadays an adrenaline junkie before that term was popular, in that he was a guy always doing the dangerous things. He had no fear of failure, whether it was swimming across a half-mile-long lake in the winter, climbing a pine tree when he was a kid, scaling a cliff, or so forth. We'll mention his appearance a few times, and he's worth, if any of the listeners wanted to do an internet search of Wally Thrasher, several pictures of him will come up. And I say that because certainly he had these kind of movie star looks that were a big part of his whole persona and even his smuggling career. Graduated from high school, didn't know what he wanted to do, spent about 3 years in the Navy, enrolled at Virginia Tech and only lasted a semester. And then sometime in his mid-20s, just on a whim, he took a flying lesson. He learned that aviation was really his thing. Just like some people are musicians who can play by ear, I'm told in my research, I learned that some pilots are just natural-born pilots, and they're just good at it. They pick up the skills very quickly, and just their kinesthetic awareness and so forth. They're just really good pilots. And that was Wally Thrasher. He went through several jobs. He did some modeling for a clothing company out of New York. He sold men's clothing. And then, bit by the aviation bug, he wanted to get a job in Florida, where there were more jobs in aviation, specifically in commercial aviation. So he moved down to the Pompano Beach area, which was a cool, hip surf town on the Pacific coast of Florida. Took several jobs that involved flying. One was as a crop duster, dusting chemicals on the orange groves that were a little bit inland, and really honed his flying skills doing that. They're flying low and avoiding telephone poles and trees and so forth. He worked as a pilot taking up skydivers for dives, worked for a transport company transporting goods to and from the Caribbean, and then also ran an air cargo service where he'd fly wealthy tourists to and from the Caribbean. Then somewhere along the line in the early 1970s, Wally Thrasher, who I mentioned before, he was an adrenaline junkie who just enjoyed the thrills of flying. Someone presented him the opportunity to make some money flying back marijuana from the Caribbean. And he was all in. Most indications are he did it just for the thrill, But then the money, when he learned he made $70,000 for that particular flight, he was hooked. A great deal of the information in me writing the book comes from his wife, whose name was Olga. And we'll talk more about her. She was originally from Portugal. Beautiful young lady that had the looks to match and keep up with Wally. So a lot of the information about his career comes from 2 days of federal grand jury testimony that she eventually presented in the 80s. She told it in detail, chapter and verse, about a lot of his exploits. Came close to death several times, crash landed a few times, but was arrested twice. Once he bribed his way out in the Bahamas, and another time spent over a year in a Mexican prison. And the book details that. So things were going good for Wally in the early 80s. He and his wife, they had 2 young children at that time. And he started to think about getting out of the business. He'd been doing it for about 10 years, which is tremendous longevity for a drug smuggling pilot. So they decided they were going to move to Virginia. And in Bland County, Virginia, he bought this huge 100-acre property, built a beautiful home there. Instead of getting out of the business, he more or less moved his operation to Virginia. Up to this point, he'd been the guy. There were other people who set up the deals, and all Wally would do, he was just like the taxi driver of the plane. He would fly the drugs from point A to point B and then get away from the plane and let other people unload it, which was one of the reasons why he never got caught. But for doing that, he would typically make anywhere between $75,000 to $150,000 per load. His comfort zone was about 1,500-pound loads of marijuana. He generally avoided other drugs, cocaine. This was in the time the movie Scarface was out. It was not too much of a stretch of what was going on in Miami and other places in the cocaine trade. He was more comfortable in marijuana. It was a less violent group of players that he was involved with. So his operation moved to Virginia. The Virginia State Police opened a case file on him in 1980, and 3 years went by, and they pretty much knew what he was doing because he had this flashy lifestyle. He paid cash for his house, paid cash for all his fleet of vehicles that he and his wife had, but they could never catch him with the drugs or the cash just because he was so good at doing what he did. And again, the book details that. His nickname was the Squirrel, hence the name Chasing the Squirrel. That was an old high school football nickname because he was really elusive on the football field. Really suited him well as a drug smuggler as well. But what he would do, he'd fly these plane loads of marijuana, typically smaller planes. Sometime he had a Beechcraft Bonanza that he flew in, and he'd fly the drugs from points south, countries like Colombia. We'll talk more about Belize is a big part of the story. And he'd fly them directly to Virginia. So there was a lot of drug interdiction in Florida going on that time. And he'd fly right past that out to little airports in Southwest Virginia, where typically the distributors from northern cities, from New York or Philadelphia or Detroit, would meet him, and then they would take the drugs from there. So things really went well for him for about 10 years. But then in October of 1984, he was scheduled to pick up a load of marijuana from Belize. Had to attend a funeral of a relative. He was actually a pallbearer in an aunt's funeral. So he let an associate of his fly his plane, his Beechcraft Bonanza, and the smuggle ended tragically in that on the return trip, the pilot, who was an associate of his named Nelson King, crashed Wally's airplane into Fancy Gap Mountain, which is out in Southwest Virginia. And writing the book, I went through the FAA and NTSB crash report on it, which is a spectacular crash. Wow. And miraculously, Nelson King got away from the plane. Passenger co-pilot was killed. Nelson King managed to walk away, and then the airplane was traced back to Wally Thrasher. And at that point, the Virginia State Police had the evidence they needed to move forward and indict Wally Thrasher for conspiracy to import drugs. Then at that point, he disappeared. He left behind his 2 kids. We'll talk more about one of them, Montana, his son, who was 6 years old at the time. At least in the United States, there have never been any credible sightings of Wally Thrasher since. His wife she was not directly involved in what Wally did and Wally's activities, but she was privy to a lot of it. So she was charged as being involved in the conspiracy. The federal government came after her, and she was facing lengthy prison sentence. She ended up cooperating with the authorities, became a federal witness, and provided them with a lot of information, not only about her husband, Wally, but about the other people, a lot of international conspirators. And we can talk more about how that ended up. But she was the witness who was actually responsible for a huge drug bust as a result of all this, actually an international bust that was one of the largest ever in the mid-Atlantic states. Then the central event of the book took place on November 4th, 1984. And what happened then was Wally Thrasher allegedly was involved in a fatal airplane crash in Belize. He had gone down to Belize to pick up a load of marijuana, and on takeoff, the plane, suspected of being overloaded, according to the crash report, crashed in the jungle there. There was auxiliary fuel tanks on the plane that caught on fire. Of course, the marijuana burned very hot as well. And fire was so intense, according to the crash report, that it actually melted the substructure of the plane. Wally Thrasher's body was burnt to ashes. A few weeks after that, one of Wally's associates shows up at Olga's house with his wedding band. And according to the story, the wedding band was found in the wreckage. It was given back. And so the federal authorities pretty much knew that if the fire was hot enough to burn a body to ashes and melt an airplane, clearly it would have melted a wedding band as well. That was one of several indications that the crash was bogus. It was a staged plane crash. And that they came to believe this is the DEA as well as U.S. Marshals then spent the better part of the next 20 years actually looking for Wally Thrasher. They believed he was maybe in a tropical land somewhere in South America or the Caribbean, or even Portugal was mentioned. But then I would want to say also, with respect to his family, his wife Olga, who I worked closely with in writing the book, she firmly believes that he died either in the crash or shortly thereafter and did not live. There's probably no one who knows more about it than her, and that's her belief. Anyway, there are several different theories on what happened to Wally, but certainly the romantic in me would find it interesting to believe that he could still be alive at age 83.
Yeah. And I guess even just starting with the most basic fact, you could have knocked me over with a feather, and this is probably just my naivete going, that there is a drug smuggling scene in Virginia. I had no idea. And again, this is clearly just naivete on my part, but I was like, wait, there's drug smuggling in Southwest Virginia? What? That was very interesting to me. How much did you learn about drug smuggling for this book, Ron? It must have been quite a lot.
It was really interesting. Yes, indeed. And you're right, here in Virginia. I think you went to Virginia Tech. I went to Radford.
I went to Hollins. Actually, in Reddick, yeah.
And you can certainly remember examples of drugs being present, and let's say marijuana, for example. And I always thought that was the stuff that people brought with them from Hampton Roads or Richmond or Northern Virginia. I didn't know that it was coming out of that area. But it would seem from my research from the book and working with the DEA folks who worked on the case and the Virginia State Police folks that a lot of this was big quantities of the drugs, that they chose Southwest Virginia because it was rural and a little bit sleepier and people weren't expecting that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then it was the folks from the big cities up north who would then come and get it, bring it north in vans. I'm not sure how much of those drugs actually found its way to the college campuses in Virginia, but it is an interesting thing for sure.
Given the long history of other types of smuggling in Virginia, certainly closer to home, Kristin, we've heard a lot about Gloucester County and all of the smuggling of drugs are not mentioned as often as is cigarettes, alcohol, and illegal firearms, but drugs are probably part of that mix as well. Boats rather than airplanes, but I think the principles are all the same, don't you think?
I think so. Again, that is my naivete talking, because I have family in Southwest Virginia, grew up there, spending time with my grandparents. And as you said, Ron, it's just so sleepy and rural. It would just never have occurred to me there are major bits of drug smuggling going on there. That was crazy to me, but it was very interesting to learn about it.
Absolutely. And a few of the state police agents who worked on these cases, they made comparisons with Wally Thrasher with the moonshiners from days gone by.
Yeah, exactly.
The television show Moonshiners that was set in Southwest Virginia. It still may be active, but those folks romanticized a little bit. And there was that same attitude toward Wally or other marijuana pilots, that they were guys, almost had this Robin Hood image. Stories of Wally Thrasher going to church bake sales, and a cake that would normally sell for $40, he'd buy it for $400 and then give it to an old lady or a single mom there. He managed to kind of manufacture this Robin Hood image. Right. And I think a lot of people who could have probably dropped a dime on him thought he was a great guy and he'd endeared themselves to them. So that was another thing I think that contributed to his longevity.
So how did you hear about Wally? He came onto your radar somehow, and he's such a great story. All of your books have been about wonderfully interesting cases and people. How did Wally ultimately make his way onto your radar?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because it has a special place in my heart. But while I was writing my first book, Under the Trestle, one of the sources for that book, who I came to be real good friends with, was Austin Hall, who was a retired Virginia State Trooper, and he was the lead investigator in the Gina Hall murder case and ultimately played a big role in convicting Steve Epperly of that murder. Austin Hall and I were having lunch one day near Radford. And he said to me, hey, he was talking about my first book. He said, hey, if this book turns out good, you ought to write about Wally Thrasher. And I said, okay, who's Wally Thrasher? And he gave me about a 5-minute monologue like I just told you guys. And right away I was hooked. I said, absolutely. That sounds like a great story. I said, can you introduce me to the people on the law enforcement side? And it turned out one of his old bosses was Dave Dean, who was a higher up with Virginia State Police who worked on this case. And then he gave me an introduction to Dave and went from there to the U.S. Marshal, Wayne Pike, who was really instrumental in me writing Chasing the Squirrel, and as well as Don Lincoln, who was a DEA agent who worked on the case. But I owe it to Austin Hall. He was the one who told me about it. And sadly, Austin Hall passed away. It's been, I guess, coming up on 2 years. But so I'm really grateful to him for putting this case on my radar.
This is a massive case in that it involved multiple law enforcement agencies. You mentioned just a couple of them. What were some of the challenges that you find in working on a book that involves, hey, I got to go talk to the DEA, know the U.S. Marshals, know the FBI, know the VSP, actually all of them all at the same time? How do you juggle all of that?
I guess first off, it took a while. Generally, my books have taken about a year to write. The fact is that the 3 books I've written so far have been cases that took place in the 80s. 1980s have kind of become my wheelhouse. My wife would say I'm stuck in the 80s in terms of fashion and music and things like that. But
nothing wrong with the 80s.
But there is a reason for that, though. It's folks in law enforcement who work those cases are now retired. They're in their 60s and 70s, so their memories are still good of those cases. And they have a little more latitude to speak freely about them.
Yeah.
If I were writing about current cases, like, for example, the thing that was on Netflix about the Alec Murdaugh cases, when it's an active case, folks don't talk. And local law enforcement, certainly not the state police, and absolutely not I made the mistake of some current cases I wanted to write about of getting in contact with the FBI, and you don't get anywhere with that. You can submit a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request, and that's a lot of times getting information about current cases is really challenging because of that.
Right.
So those kind of things don't lend themselves well, and that's why I have found my niche in writing about old, cold cases. To answer your question, Kristin, I found that those folks are just really willing to share their experiences. Like all of us, as we get older, we've got memories that we want to remember them, but we also want other people to know about them. When a knucklehead like me comes along that wants to write about it and wants to interview them, in most cases, they're really happy to talk. That's been my experience in dealing with retired law enforcement people.
Ron, from a practical point of view, I know you have a background as a journalist. Will these retired law enforcement folks, will they let you record a conversation, or do they expect you to take notes? How's it work logistically? Because you talk to a lot of people in putting your books together.
I do, and I've done it both ways. I've recorded some, and what I found out, and I know other people have had this problem too, is when you record someone, a lot of times they hold back things they don't want to say.
Right.
So generally, what I'll do is I'll tell them, hey, I'm not going to record this, but I'm going to take notes. And I'll take those notes. And then once I've written it, the passages of the book with their information, I'll circle back to them and say, hey, this is what I wrote from our interview. Tell me if this is accurate. And occasionally they'll make some changes. And a lot of times one word can make a big difference. So they'll do that. Or I'll circle back to them with a second interview. About a week ago, I talked to a forensics guy, a guy named Al Burns, who was a senior forensics guy in the city of Chesapeake. So we spent about an hour on the phone. And then I will circle back to him and follow up on some of those questions and then say, hey, now they send him a written copy. This is what you told me. I just want to make sure all of this is accurate. So I found for me that tends to work pretty well.
Was there any law enforcement agency that basically said, nah, sorry, we're not talking about this?
Yeah, that would be the U.S. Marshals, and they're under the Department of Justice, as is the FBI. But I came to be really impressed with them. The one guy who's a source for this book, Wayne Pike, who's a retired U.S. Marshal. He shared a lot of information with me. I actually went to his house one day, and then we interviewed him for a documentary that I'll share a little bit about maybe a bit later. What he was sharing was pretty much things that are on the public record. There were things we would ask him, and he would say, I'm sorry, but I can't talk about that. And then what I learned about my research about the U.S. Marshals is they are better than anyone in federal law enforcement at keeping a secret. And their biggest and best secret is the Witness Protection Program.
Oh, WITSEC, okay.
Yeah, they administer WITSEC. It's under their jurisdiction. Witness protection has been around since 1970, and they have never lost a client.
Wow.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? Now, they've had people, what's interesting is about 70% of the people who go into WITSEC, who go into witness protection, they're criminals. So a lot of those, when they're in witness protection, they'll go back to their criminal ways, maybe get back, and they'll come out themselves with where they are and what they're doing. And some of them have gotten harmed and actually left witness protection, I think. But for people that comply and who keep the low profile they're supposed to, yeah, they have a 100% success rate. And I'm knocking on wood. I think I'm going to jinx them. But I'm amazed at how well they can keep a secret. And there were two of their active folks that I called about the Wally Thrasher case. I'm asking about something from 40 years ago, and they were quick to say, I can't talk about that. I can't even acknowledge that.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Just tremendous amount of respect for U.S. Marshals and their ability to keep a secret like no one I've ever known.
While we're on the subject, could Wally Thrasher have been put into witness protection?
He could. Yes, indeed, Bill. He could. I tend to not think so because I know that at least the optics appeared that the U.S. Marshals were spending a lot of time looking for him. And Wayne Pike told me that. And again, that was on the record. There were wanted posters. They went out of their way to go to all these foreign countries and islands in the Caribbean and post wanted posters. So they spent a lot of time and manpower doing that. And I don't think they'd have gone to that length if they were also hiding him. Really, with this case, who knows? That could certainly be. There were several conspiracy theorists I talked to both when I was writing the book and since it's come out. It's probably exaggeration to call them conspiracy theorists. They think that there's a chance that the federal authorities turn their back and let Wally get away. Said, hey, as long as we don't see you again, we're going to let you go. Wally took pride in not being a snitch. There's no evidence he ever cooperated or snitched on any of his associates, but there's always that possibility that he shared some information, he cooperated, and for doing that, they let him go, let him leave the country and said, hey, don't come back again. Now, his family, people that know him would say he would have never done that. He would have never left his family. He had 2 young kids, not to mention his wife. Keep in mind, he was facing a lengthy prison sentence here in the United States. So yeah, I think that or some variation of it could be one of the many possibilities.
I got the sense at the end of it that the U.S. Marshals were doing a certain amount of wailing and gnashing of teeth and going, we haven't caught him yet. It seemed like it must have been a very frustrating thing for them. There are so many different facets and levels to this book. I loved reading it because it's so complex. We've talked a little bit about the law enforcement side and the people that you worked with for law enforcement, but let's talk about Olga Thrasher and Montana Thrasher. I imagine they were receptive to doing this book. What kind of working relationship did you have with them as you worked through the process of doing the research and the writing?
Yeah, we had a great relationship. I spent many hours on the phone with Olga. I would call her to ask just a few questions or get clarification on something, and then we would end up talking for 2 hours. She was living in Georgia at the time, and she is now in her 60s. And just to set the ages here, so when they met and got married, and I might be a year off both ways here, but Olga was 23 and Wally was 37. So there was an age gap there. I guess more to your question, they were both very helpful. They'd had several people contact them over the years wanting to do a movie. There was someone who wanted to do not a documentary, but an actual production movie. Several people wanted to write a book and even got started and just never quite finished it. So they were really, really receptive to it. The fact that I'd written another book that took place in that area, I think gave me a little bit of credibility with both of them. But they just wanted me to tell it as accurately as I could. And then Montana in particular, I really came to have a lot of respect and admiration for him. A really cool part of the story is that, and again, just to recap, so Wally had a son named Montana who was 6 years old when Wally died or disappeared. Just idolized his father, you can imagine. Montana became a police officer when he grew up.
Interesting.
Yes, he was a career police officer. And last I spoke with him, it's been a few months ago, but he was still with the police department in suburban or in Georgia, I should say. So that was really interesting. So he's used some of his law enforcement skills as he's called around and he's talked to some of his father's old associates. So yeah, Montana and Olga have both been really helpful. And we continue to correspond on social media. And then Montana I talk to about every few months. So he was 6 years old in 1984.
He's 44, maybe.
Yeah.
Like he's a little older than I am, yeah.
So mid-career.
You had mentioned earlier that Olga believes that Wally did, in fact, die in that plane crash in Belize. Does Montana believe that as well? Or is he actively trying to find his death?
He is, and I think he went through a period of time where he was actively following up on leads and talking to old people. Not so much anymore. I don't want to speak for him, but I would say, and again, not speaking for him, he's more open to possibilities of what may or may not have happened. He's more open to that. Olga, in her conversations with me, while she didn't comment directly on the alleged plane crash, she feels strongly that if he didn't die in that, he died shortly thereafter. The analogy, he was like if he was a cat with 9 lives, which he was, he had probably used 8 of them up to that point. In terms of the crashes he had and the arrests, and he'd had 83 and 84, he'd had a string of just incredibly bad luck. He lost 2 1,500-pound loads of marijuana that he would have had to pay for. He had someone fleece him out of some money in one deal, which was something that had never happened to him just because, the gentlemanly way he did business. And there was a guy we can talk about a little bit who, toward the end of Wally's smuggling career, he worked closely with a man out of Belize named John Angel Zabane, who was one of the largest growers. Belize at that time, it's interesting, the country Belize, the population is only about half the size of Virginia Beach. But at one point, they were the 4th largest producer of marijuana in the world. So it was, at least the country and the jungles were one great big marijuana farm with about 20 runways that oriented toward the Caribbean Sea where American pilots could land, get loaded, and fly out. It was just an amazing operation. The drug lord, I guess you could call him, that he dealt with there was John Angel Zabane, who's still alive today in his 70s. There were some of the folks I talked to who felt that because Wally owed him money, he could have potentially done Wally harm. And so that's certainly a chance as well.
Okay. I can see that D.B. Cooper and Wally Thrasher would probably have gotten along fairly well together. Was that like an obvious parallel that you saw between them as you were doing the research? Or is that just a me thing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great comparison. Both of the cases, they're ones that we don't know exactly what happened to the person. And they're both people that are both criminals, but they've become heroes in modern folklore.
Kind of folk heroes, exactly.
D.B. Cooper, they are, which is just funny how our society is. But yeah, it's very interesting. We think both of them, we imagine them getting away with millions of dollars. And one thing I didn't say about Wally is that he had money in foreign bank accounts. It was confirmed in the Cayman Islands, which are, in terms of secrecy and security, would be his to go back to if he ever did.
Were those funds ever withdrawn quietly by a retiree from Portugal or something?
I'd like to think so, but who knows?
Ron, I think that romantic notion that we all have, it is often attached to smugglers and I fought the law.
Pirates,
smugglers, moonshiners, they all fit that sort of outlaw character that we often root for. Rare that you're watching an old show with moonshiners, rum runners, zooming down back roads, and who's rooting for the cops to catch the revenue, or the revenuers to catch the smuggler? You're rooting for them to get away, aren't you?
Absolutely. And you know who in pop culture who has really glorified these guys is Jimmy Buffett.
Yeah.
I'm not a parrot head, but I am a Jimmy Buffett fan. He's on my playlist, some of his songs. He's probably written half dozen songs that are either about smugglers or refer to smugglers. And, the song, A Pirate, I mentioned in the book, A Pirate Looks at 40.
Yes.
I've done a bit of smuggling. I've run my share of grass, made enough money to buy Miami, but I pissed it away so fast. Could have been writing about Wally Thrasher in that song. It is a very popular notion we all have.
After writing this fantastic book, what are some of the questions that you still have in regard to Wally outside of, is he still alive and he's not wasting away in Margaritaville, but probably somewhere along those lines? What are your questions other than, is Wally still out there? And I like the idea that he is, by the way. I think that's fun.
I guess that really would be the big one there. There was also related to this just some other investigations, the information Olga provided. Really, for me, I guess when I set out to write it, I got most of my questions answered about Wally. He's just a guy you'd like to have a beer with. One, he could tell these stories all the time about his, the book touches on about 8 or 10 brushes with death he had on these flights, either crash landings or in Colombia, the crew that was loading his plane that was all coked up that turned around and started attacking him. But I guess in terms of unanswered questions, you'd like to ask Wally why he did this. I think he could have been successful at anything he tried. Certainly,
yeah, really.
We certainly had a sales personality, but he could have been a great attorney as well. Basically anything he put his mind to. But he's just somebody you'd like to have a beer with and just let him go and tell stories.
Do you feel like there's any way forward to confirm whether Wally's alive or not?
Only if I had wondered if he was alive, if there would come a time, and I should mention first, the federal warrants for him have expired. He's no longer, and in the scheme of things, what he did back then, it was like, we got to catch these marijuana smugglers and put them in prison for the rest of their lives. And you look how things have changed now. By no means am I pro-marijuana, but nowadays, it's certainly not looked down on by the law nearly as much.
No, not at all, really.
Exactly. Getting back to your question, the only thing would be if Wally came back to the United States and said, hey, here's my story. If he died and someone else came forward and said, hey, he was my best friend for years here or whatever, that would certainly be interesting. But yes, he would be 83. I should say he had a very good family history. He had, I think, parents and brothers and sisters. He had an uncle who lived to be 103.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy? And he was really active. He didn't smoke. He was just a social drinker. And for most of his life, he was a runner. He would run every day, go out for a run, or back in, I guess in the day, they called that jogging. And I would think if he were around, he'd probably be in pretty good health.
He actually looks like the actor George Peppard in some of these photographs. And Olga is stunningly beautiful. They're really a very handsome couple in these photographs.
They sure are. And that was the other thing when I thought of writing the book. I would show their pictures. People would ask me, you guys have, what are you writing about next? I'm writing about this guy. And I'd show Wally and Olga's picture. And they'd be like, oh my God, that's a Hollywood couple.
Yeah,
and,
exactly. Both
of them. And Wally, when he'd walk through a commercial airport and people would point at him and think he was a celebrity.
Yeah.
And very often he'd go along with it. People would think he was Merle Haggard, or one time even Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, he does look like those guys.
He's got Burt Bacharach vibes for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a younger, good-looking Burt Bacharach. Absolutely. And then in the book, Olga tells a story that's in the book about when they were dating, and he took her to Vegas for a weekend. He flew her out to Vegas, scored some tickets for a Frank Sinatra concert. Ooh. And they really good seats, like right up front. And they were seated right next to Frank Sinatra's personal table, his family table, where Frank Sinatra had some family members and friends. So Wally being Wally, he'd worn a tuxedo to that night. He walked over himself, hey, I'm Wally. And these beautiful blue eyes and looking like he did. And they were like, hey, Wally. And they thought he was someone famous. And they said, hey, why don't you come after the concert? Come on backstage. We're going to go and have a drink with Frank. Sure.
Oh, fun.
The concert ends in Vegas. And sure enough, they're like, yeah, come on, Wally and Olga. And they go backstage and Wally introduced himself. Hey, Frank, I'm Wally. And just really nonchalant. And Olga tells his story. And meanwhile, Olga's like, oh, my God, we're here having a drink with Frank Sinatra. So that was just how he rolled. And I guess one of the things that made me want to write about him.
Do you think this book, which is absolutely wonderful, could ever be made into a movie or a limited television series? It sure feels like it, I think, to both Kristin and to me.
Yeah, thank you. And it does the story itself even. And that was so many people I talked to even before I started writing it said, wow, this story needs to be a movie. I did about 6 months after it came out. I sold the movie rights, or I should say the documentary film rights, to a company out of Los Angeles called Urban Legends Film Company. The CEO of that company is a guy named Doug Tower, who He does a lot of work actually with investigation discovery. He's filmed a lot of the Joe Kenda things that you see.
Okay.
But a network like ID or even HGTV or Discovery Channel, they outsource a lot of their content. And a company like Doug's Urban Legends Film Company they'll produce a 30-minute or hour-long show that they'll air. And Bill, I know you worked in that industry. You know a lot more about it than me. So Doug has never done a full-length documentary piece, but he envisions this as a multi-episode television series.
Yeah.
Obviously, Netflix would be like the holy grail, obviously.
Yeah.
But realistically, maybe a long shot, although these things, who knows? But the timing was right. When the book came out, this was right during the peak of COVID, the pandemic. Studios had shut down. So companies like that were pushing outside Hollywood because they couldn't make movies like they used to for these stories, documentaries that they could make out. Doug and his Urban Legends crew have put a lot of resources into it. It's been over a year ago. He brought a whole crew out and did interviews down in Florida. We went and interviewed some of Wally's old associates. One of the guys we mentioned in the book, a guy named Dickie Sennett,
Yes,
who flew with Wally. We interviewed him and some other folks down there. Stopped off in Georgia and interviewed Olga in Montana.
Oh, very cool.
And then also in South Carolina, in North Carolina, we talked to one of his attorneys, Keith Neely, who worked closely with Olga in her legal defense. And then finally in Virginia, interviewing the folks in Virginia who worked on the case. I'm not that involved in it. I'm letting him do his thing with that in California, along with a lot of his other projects. But I know he's had some high-level meetings with some of the streaming services. It doesn't look like it'll be something in a theater release, more like a streaming service, which so much of the documentary content. I mentioned earlier the Netflix series about the Alec Murdaugh case, which I thought was exceptionally well done with recreations. You couldn't even tell if the recreations were the real thing or not.
Yeah, it was very well done.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be, in terms of my hopes and expectations, something like that, with integrating a lot of the flying and the
I think it'd be very cool
and so forth. Yeah, it looks like it would be a little ways off though if something were to happen with that, but it was good to at least get that going in that direction.
I know that the documentary for Under the Trestle that you're doing with Scott McTavish is coming along swimmingly. Can we expect to see it hit the airwaves before too terribly much longer?
I hope so. I don't have an exact timetable. There was a point where I was hoping by the end of the summer, fall. We'd originally envisioned that as just a one-off documentary, a 90-minute or 2-hour documentary. And then a recent trip to Nashville about 6 weeks ago, I did some narration with it, and Scott and I talked about it. He had some interest from an interested party who may get involved, who would like to see it as a 4-episode series.
Okay.
And we talked about that, and certainly there's enough content there with that case, with the background and then the investigation and then the trial and then the ongoing search for Gina Hall's remains.
Yes.
Where there's really enough content. You could see 4 60-minute episodes. But with that, Scott's been nice enough. He worked previously out of New York City. Now he's out of Nashville. But I've been closely involved with that, working with him. And he's been nice enough to let me provide input each step of the way. That process I'm a lot more involved in. I think we're a lot closer to finishing that up. As far as the timing, it still remains to be determined. But that, like the others, like the other I mentioned, would be a lot of on-camera interviews with the key people involved. We may also do some reenactments with that, as well as a lot of the scenery in and around the New River Valley that was a big part of this story.
Once that does come out, of course, we will have you, and we'd like to have Scott as well come on and talk about the process and the finished product.
That would be awesome. That would be great. As I think I said this on camera, but I'm really grateful for all the help you guys have given me over the years, and certainly helped me a lot. And I appreciate it. It's been awesome to see your success with your podcast as well.
Oh, thank you. So go ahead and just give us a quick rundown of all 3 of your titles and where everybody can find them, please.
Sure. My books are available now at Barnes & Noble and also Amazon, as well as independent booksellers it's great to support those. So my first book, Under the Trestle, is about the Gina Renee Hall murder case. It was the first no-body murder conviction in Virginia. The killer, Steve Epperly, was convicted of first-degree murder, has been in prison 43 years. And the big question in that case is, where are Gina Hall's remains, which, according to Virginia State Police, are still undiscovered. Then the second book we talked about was Chasing the Squirrel. And then my third book that came out in 2021 was called Eyes of a Monster. That's about a series of cold case murders in my old hometown of Hampton, Virginia. when in 2015, a detective named Randy Mayer, who's now retired and living in Alaska, reopened the cases and managed to link 3 murders to a killer who was in his 60s and brought him to trial on one of the murders, and he was convicted and now in prisons. But it's a great cold case story. Then I should tell you my latest book, which I had one more round of final editing, and it should be out this summer, but the title is In the Wind. And it's another true crime book, and was very fortunate. I had a retired female detective who's in her late 70s get in touch with me. Her name is Kay Shucker. Back when she worked the case, her name was Kay Lewis. Her background and the early chapters in the book, we'll talk about it a great deal. Kay was one of the first female police officers in Hampton Roads back in the 70s. Also, the first female detective in Chesapeake and one of the first in Hampton Roads. So a big part of the story is her challenges back then with discrimination as a female and even some harassment. For example, when she was working as a police dispatcher and wanted to be a police officer and went to the Human Resource Office in Chesapeake and said, I'd like an application to be a police officer. And they said, I'm sorry, but we don't hire women.
Ouch.
But so a lot of it is about her challenges and how she came to be a detective. And then in 1981, she was the lead detective in just a fascinating case when an Old Dominion University student by the name of Janice Starr went missing. She disappeared, and it fell in Chesapeake's jurisdiction because she lived just in an apartment just across the Chesapeake line in Chesapeake. But a lot of the action in the book takes place at ODU. So Kay was the lead investigator in that case, along with a few male detectives who backed her up. And she had her own theory on the case. She believed the missing student, Janice Starr, was having an affair with one of her professors. The other detectives did not think that and told her she was barking up the wrong tree and told her not to go after this professor. But she gradually, over the course of a few months, built a case against him. Takes some really dramatic twists and turns from there in terms of the investigation and in terms of this professor. I can't give it away, but
sure.
Quite bizarre and also quite sensational. Then come to find out that unfortunately the student was murdered, and then months go by, her remains have not been found, and Kay is working hard on trying to find what she thinks is a clandestine grave. And eventually, just through some awesome detective work, does find an area where she thinks that Janice was buried, brings a team of people out there to look for her. And then the book ends with what they either do or don't find.
Oh, wow.
Grave.
It sounds amazing.
Thank you. And I'd written it, and then I had an editor and publisher tell me, the crime story is good, but you've got to do a better job of talking about the challenges that the detective went through as a female. So then I got some more female input on that and rewrote that part of it. And I think it's a good story that anyone would relate to, but certainly in this current climate we live in, it's a great book with regard to women's issues and the ongoing equality for women.
We will make sure that we have you back on to talk about that as well. We'll do the whole Ron Peterson quartet of books.
God, you're too kind.
That's going to wrap it up for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.